Ask anyone to name Queen's most famous song, and almost everyone says the same 6 words: Bohemian Rhapsody. But that song lived on an album, and almost nobody remembers the album's real story. Because while the world was falling in love with 6 spectacular minutes of opera and rock, the band who made it was in private completely broke. Not broke in the sense of struggling songwriters, broke as in years of global fame, sold-out tours, 3 hit albums, and somehow still barely enough money between them to live on. So here is the part almost nobody tells you. A Night at the Opera was not made by a band riding high and comfortable. It was made by 4 musicians staring down financial ruin, betting absolutely everything on the single most extravagant, most reckless, most expensive album any rock band had ever attempted. If it failed, it would not just embarrass them, it could have ended Queen for good. This is the story of the gamble hiding inside one of the most celebrated albums ever made. And almost none of it happened by accident.
To understand the gamble, you first have to understand exactly how strange Queen's situation was in 1975. From the outside, they looked like a band that had made it. 3 albums out, growing crowds, real chart success, a name people were starting to recognize. From the inside, it felt completely different. Despite the fame, despite the touring, despite the record sales, the 4 members of Queen were, in practical terms, living on very little money. The reason traced back to the deal they had signed years earlier, when they were unknown and desperate for any chance at all, with the management and production company that controlled almost everything around them. That contract had looked like a lifeline once. By 1975, it looked like a trap. The band that the world assumed was rich was, quietly, running out of road. And that fear, the fear of being famous and broke at the same time, is the real starting point of this story, not the music, the money.
The company was called Trident, and back in the early days it had done something genuinely valuable. It gave 4 unsigned musicians studio time, equipment, a way in, when nobody else would take the risk. But the price of that early support was a contract that handed Trident a punishing share of everything Queen would ever earn for years to come, on records, on touring, on merchandise. As the band's fame grew, the imbalance grew with it. Bigger tours, bigger album sales, and yet the 4 men who were actually on stage kept seeing only a small fraction of the money their own name was generating. By 1975, the frustration had turned into something closer to desperation. They brought in a new manager, John Reid, who also worked with Elton John, and made the decision to break away from Trident entirely. It was the right call. It was also financially brutal in the short term. Breaking a contract like that meant lawyers, settlements, and a period where the band had less certainty about money than at almost any point since they'd become famous.
So picture the actual moment A Night at the Opera began. Queen were not sitting on a pile of royalties, relaxed and free to experiment. They were mid-lawsuit, mid-negotiation, genuinely unsure how much money they had access to, walking into a recording studio to make the most important album of their careers so far. Most bands in that position play it safe. You cut costs, you keep things simple, you protect what little stability you have left. Queen did the opposite. Freddie, Brian, Roger and John made a decision that on paper made no financial sense at all. Instead of scaling back, they decided to make the biggest, most ambitious, most technically demanding record they possibly could. Broke, uncertain, legally exposed, and they chose to spend more than any rock band ever had on a single album. It was either the smartest gamble in the band's history or the fastest way to finish it completely. There was no safe version of what they were about to do.
The clearest sign of how far they were willing to go was the studios themselves. A cautious band making a record on borrowed time books one studio, works fast, keeps the bill down. Queen booked 4. They moved between 4 separate recording studios across the country, chasing whichever room, whichever desk, whichever engineer gave a particular song the sound they wanted, rather than settling for whatever one studio could offer. That kind of studio hopping was almost unheard of for a band in their position, and it was staggeringly expensive. Every move meant new setup costs, new hired time, new pressure on a budget that barely existed. But it meant every track could be chased to its absolute best version, rather than a compromise dictated by convenience. Word started to spread in the industry that this was turning into one of the most expensive albums ever attempted. For a band that was, in truth, close to broke, that reputation was either going to be their triumph or their epitaph. They kept going anyway.
Inside those studios, one musician was quietly pushing things further than almost anyone in rock had gone before. Brian May did not just play guitar parts. He built entire sections of the album out of nothing but his own guitar, layered again and again, take after take, until dozens of overdubbed lines stacked into something that sounded like a full orchestra. Strings, horns, choirs of sound, all of it created from a single homemade instrument he and his father had built years earlier, run through an amplifier he'd also built himself. It was slow, exhausting, meticulous work, hour after hour of recording one guitar line, then another, tuning each one to sit inside the last, on a record they could not afford to run over schedule on. He wasn't just playing guitar. He was quietly inventing an entire fake orchestra out of one instrument, out of pure stubbornness. It became one of the album's most extraordinary, least visible achievements. Almost nobody outside the studio knew it was happening in real time.
With the pressure mounting, the band needed somewhere to breathe, and they found it at a converted farmhouse studio in the Welsh countryside. Between punishing sessions, exhausted and strung out from months of overdubbing, the band would unwind by watching old films together, and one film in particular became their favorite. A wild, chaotic Marx Brothers comedy called A Night at the Opera. Something about its title, its theatrical absurdity, its total lack of restraint, seemed to match exactly what they were trying to make. So Freddie suggested naming the album after it, and the rest of the band agreed almost instantly. It's a small human detail, easy to miss. A band on the edge of financial disaster, naming their most extravagant work after a comedy they watched to keep from cracking under the pressure. The title was a joke. The stakes behind it were not. That contrast is exactly what makes the story of this record so unusual.
If you want proof of how far they were pushing themselves, listen to the album's longest, strangest track. Freddie had woken from a vivid dream about a devastating flood and turned it into an 8-minute epic built around warning, prophecy, and consequence. In the middle of it, the song does something almost nobody else was doing at the time. Freddie's own voice splits into a round, echoing and answering itself, layered again and again until it sounds like an entire choir arguing with one man. It took hours of painstaking vocal work to build that single section, on a schedule and budget that had no real room for hours to spare. But nobody involved treated it as optional. Every corner of this album got the same treatment, no shortcuts, no safe choices, no matter what it cost them. It's the clearest evidence that this was never meant to be an ordinary record. It was meant to be undeniable.
By the time the album was finished, the numbers behind it were frightening. It had taken longer, cost more, and demanded more from every member of the band than anything they had made before, at the exact moment they could least afford it to fail. If listeners rejected it, if critics dismissed it as overblown, Queen would be left with crushing costs, an ongoing legal battle with their old management, and a damaged reputation, all at once. There was no cushion left to absorb a disappointment. Freddie reportedly carried real anxiety about how it would land,
aware that this record was not just an artistic statement, it was close to a make-or-break financial event for four men who had already sacrificed a great deal to get this far. This was not a band flexing confidence. This was a band that had gone all in, with nothing left to fall back on. Everything now depended on how the public responded. All they could do was wait.
And then, in the final weeks of 1975, A Night at the Opera was released into the world. The response was immediate. It shot to #1 in the United Kingdom, and Bohemian Rhapsody, the single pulled from it, became one of the defining songs of the decade, sitting at the top of the charts for weeks on end. But the deeper victory was quieter than the chart position. The album's success gave Queen, for the first time in years, real financial breathing room, and it gave them something arguably more valuable. Proof, undeniable and public, that stepping away from Trident and betting everything on ambition had been the right call. Critics who might have mocked the extravagance instead marveled at it. The gamble that could have ended the band instead became the record that saved it. And it changed what Queen believed they were allowed to attempt next. Nothing about their career looked the same afterward.
What A Night at the Opera really proved, underneath all the studio hours and the multi-tracked guitars, was something about the band's character. Faced with genuine financial danger, the easy choice, the sensible choice, would have been to retreat, to play it safe until the money situation stabilized. Queen looked at that same danger and decided the only way through it was forward, at full volume, with absolutely nothing held back. That instinct, chase the biggest possible version of the idea, whatever the cost, whatever the risk, became the blueprint for the rest of their career. It's there in the operatic ambition of the songs that followed, in the stadium-sized swagger of the tours that came after, even in the way they would later treat a 20-minute festival slot as the single most important performance of their lives. A Night at the Opera wasn't just an album. It was the moment Queen decided ambition was worth betting everything on. And it's a bet they kept making, again and again, for the rest of their story. That pattern started here, in a year nobody expected them to survive financially at all.
So the next time Bohemian Rhapsody comes on the radio and everyone around you sings along without a second thought, remember what was actually happening behind it. You are not just hearing a great song. You're hearing the sound of four musicians who were, by any normal measure, in serious financial trouble, refusing to shrink, refusing to play safe, and betting everything they had left on one enormous, reckless, meticulously built record. It could have bankrupted them. It could have finished the band before most of the world had even fully discovered them. Instead, it became one of the most celebrated albums in rock history, precisely because they refused to make it small. If you'd like to hear more of the stories hiding behind the songs you already know, the real ones, the ones that never make it into the liner notes, stay with us. There's a whole catalogue of them, and every single one hides more risk, more stubbornness, and more nerve than you'd expect. The next time you hear that album, listen for the sound of a band with absolutely nothing left to lose. That's the part the music never tells you on its own.